Prepare, respond, survive. When seconds count, train with the best. Fire facilities, custom steel towers built for real-world fire training. Be ready, be resilient.
Good morning, everybody. Billy Hucks, host of Point of Origin Podcast, joined today, episode 2. By my co-host Bobby Drake, and a pretty special guest, pretty instrumental in my career, at least educating me along the way of what I've been doing right and a lot of times what I'm doing wrong. Regional Director Rob Dawson. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Hey, good morning, Billy and Bobby. Thanks for having me on. This is quite an honor to be here with you guys and share some things and talk about some history too. But it's even more an honor to be on one of your early episodes and look forward to what you guys bring to the table going forward with this podcast.
Amen.
No, definitely. Bobby and I've talked a lot. This whole thing stemmed from a conversation that we got flung into at FDIC this past year. We just happened to be the couple of guys that were in the at the right spot at the wrong time. They, a couple of guests for a live podcast there in the fishbowl, got hung up on their flight. And the wife grabbed me up and said, "Hey, you and Bobby, all this stuff you've been complaining about, we need to go talk about it. You got 5 minutes." So that stemmed to a couple phone calls after, a lot of conversations. Bobby and I, laughed last episode. Some days we live 20 minutes apart and we still haven't seen each other face to face since April. So, thankfully, we've got technology at our hands today, and again, I'd like to really kick this early episode off with something that's near and dear to me. NFPA, regardless of your viewpoint, regardless of your stance, regardless of your comments on social media, NFPA is an organization, I'll say, that was designed to have interaction from folks, right? People on the job in the fire service. And hopefully we'll get into a little bit of that today. It's enough of me talking. Robbie, give us how did you get to where you got, Robbie?
It's kind of a long journey, I guess. I started as a volunteer with the Volunteer Rescue Squad here in Henrico, Lakeside Volunteer Rescue Squad as a 15-year-old junior member, and I got to hang around with a bunch of older at the time, 20-ish year old guys who were in the fire service, and went, I actually get to do this stuff and they'll pay me to do it and only have to work 10 days a month. This is going to be awesome. And I skipped school one day my senior year and went to take the entrance test in Chesterfield and got hired just a few months after I graduated high school, and spent the bulk of my career there. When I go to paramedic school, was one of the first paramedics in the department, wound up being assigned to the med flight program with the state police for a few years. That was an awesome experience. And then took a job in Hanover County for a couple of years with their early EMS system, as they were an EMS department. Came back to Chesterfield. Fortunately, was able to get back to Chesterfield. I knew the fire side of the equation was really not being met for me in Hanover. I missed that, either the camaraderie with the station and the job of fighting fire and doing that job function for years, and came back to Chesterfield and was fortunate enough to get back in there and got promoted to lieutenant. Was on an engine company for a few years, and kind of tripped and fell my way into the fire marshal's office in the county, and wound up staying there for basically the balance of it. I got promoted a couple of times, stayed in the office as a deputy and then the battalion chief as a fire marshal. And ultimately, when Chief Center came in, he reorganized the upper echelon and the senior team and promoted a bunch of us to assistant chiefs. And there were 5 of us, and I was fortunate enough to be one that was over the fire marshal's office, as well as all of the emergency management during non-emergency and non-disasters, and kind of worked that piece of the equation. It did a lot of stuff there. Really enjoyed my career in Chesterfield, and had a fantastic time of learning from people, and had some great mentors along the way as well. But I was eligible to retire and was kind of looking for the next challenge. And along came this regional director's position with the National Fire Protection Association. I'd been involved with NFPA through the International Fire Marshals Association and being a member of a couple of technical committees for several years. And this opportunity existed. I jumped at the opportunity. Somebody asked me one not too long ago why I like this job with NFPA, and I think the biggest part of it is while I'm not in the fire service proper, I'm still not dragging hose down hallways. I'm still engaged with the fire service community and staying in touch with guys like you and being able to interact with our firefighter brothers and sisters across the U.S. at this point and do that job within the fire community really is fulfilling to me, and staying part of that kind of community is really enjoyable to me at this point in my career.
That's awesome. That's Bobby and I talked last episode. We both took very twisted roads to get where we ended up, and you were very instrumental early in my career, especially once you got into the fire marshal's office. Of course, I was there in Chesterfield, and it was definitely a cool experience to kind of see you and see the pathways that you went. Even with the state's technical review board, a lot of people don't know that even exists, and what it's there for and the purpose. And I truly believe that there's a huge education piece, which is why we're talking today, to educate the fire service, truly educate the fire service. We're always going to complain about something. Again, let's take it down the pathway. Bobby and I just had a conversation over the weekend, about his position, sitting on a 1400 committee. There's some questions here in Virginia, about some burn building standards, and it really comes down to an interpretation. And you're talking about things that are. I always go back, and there's somebody I know very, very well, Ed Altizer, former state fire marshal in Virginia. And, there's one thing that Ed always told me. It always goes back to the intent. What was the intent of the standard? What was the intent of the code that was written? And a lot of times you may get lucky enough to go back down the road of talking to some of those folks that maybe were a part of that fully understood the intent. Sometimes the code's not black and white. Sometimes the standard's not black and white. How do we get to that point? So, Bobby, your position as a battalion chief, still active. I'm not sure that you're pulling hose down a hallway anymore. You still may want to, but, give us your perspective as being a technical committee member, very active on 1400.
Yeah, I mean, I represent the end user, right? And so for the people that don't know and understand how that works, we'll talk a little bit more about it. But there's different groups within our fire service that are represented on these technical committees, and so I'm the end user. I'm representing the boots on the ground, if you will. And I will tell you, you all got into codes and standards because it was part of your career path, right? Like you worked into the fire marshal's office, you worked in that. I got into it because I was the naysayer. I was that guy that didn't believe in NFPA. And they oftentimes say the best way to get into something is to try to fight against it. And you'll sometimes find your way right through the door. And look, I didn't know what I didn't know. And one of my mentors asked me one day, how do you know what you know? Is it because you studied it, because you read it, because you learned it, you practiced it, you validated it, or just because somebody told you and you took it to heart and went with it? And that's the world I was living in. When I got in the fire department, I was told NFPA was made up of a bunch of private industry businessmen that didn't care about us. They were all in it for profit. And that was the only reason why the standards and the codes were being created. And right, wrong, or indifferent, as a young training officer, at some point, I probably shared that narrative to some degree until I was educated, until somebody showed me, no, man, you're wrong. Let me explain this to you. So to your point, yeah, I had the opportunity in the last couple of years to sit on 1400, as the technical committee with training during this consolidation project. And it has been so eye-opening to see the boots on the ground, to see, the Dan Shaws, the Doug Mitchells, the Brian Brushes, the Ian Bennettts. I'm certainly not as well known as some of those guys, but, guys like myself and them, that are out there teaching at conferences, doing the job, have a following, and are actually speaking out in favor of these codes and standards and the work we're doing at NFPA. And I think we're in that paradigm shift, right? That's a lot of what we've talked about in the last couple episodes, is how do we shift that culture, right? And that's what I'm trying to do. As the operations battalion chief, I'm trying to help guys and gals that have that, those stickers and those T-shirts and those hats that, say whatever, like, tell me why you have that. Tell me how you've got there. Because I agree, right? Like we just talked about the burn building stuff. Some of it, the interpretation, like it's difficult. It's tough. It doesn't make sense. We're trying to navigate some of that stuff, but work through the process. And I think that's where I am in this one, right? I am bridging that gap of the standards, understanding the standards, and then understanding how people can get involved in the process. And I think that's really where my role as the BC, and still being the end user on the committee comes into play.
Yeah, Bobby, I'll echo that. And that's a challenge I had even in my own department before I retired from Chesterfield. I was on technical committees, and kudos to you for engaging in that process. My deputy chief at the time, he was over operations and training. And he told me one day in a hallway, said, "Hey, you need to get these NFPA people to fix this standard on hazardous materials. It's wrong." I'm like, Rick, that's not how it works, man. It's the NFPA staff. In fact, I now and all of the NFPA staff are the only people who are prohibited from participating in that process. As an ANSI accredited consensus standard organization, we are prohibited from influencing that process. And I told Rick then, I said, here's how you do it. And I walked him through the process of how to put a public input in, how to do a public comment, how to influence the standard and change it to what he believed was better. And he did that. And today he's the chair of one of those hazmat committees. So he's, he I don't want to say drank the Kool-Aid, but he didn't know what he didn't know of how these standards are developed. And you educate somebody, and that got educated much like yourself did. And, okay, now I see how it works. Now I can have an impact on how 1400 or 1300 or whatever standard is you're interested in is developed. And, that's a very common misconception that it's the government is developing these NFPA standards, even in the public. It's the industry. And in fact, the Standards Council, which appoints all these technical committees, has a very close eye on who's on the committee, where they work, and who they represent. And they've gone so far as to disassemble one committee or two in the past because things got out of balance. There was not the appropriate representation of end users, enforcers, and the industry at the table to develop that standard going forward. So they have no qualms about telling everybody, you're off the committee, we're starting from scratch, and everybody has to reapply and reseat that committee to make sure that it's got appropriate representation from all of those interest groups, so that we, NFPA, can have the best standards out there for the end user, whether they're firefighters, building officials, equipment manufacturers, or whoever that may be.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great point because, we've had some pretty animated conversations in technical committees. I mean, as I'm sure you being involved in committees, and it's because of that balance, right? Because there are so many different groups being represented, and there are different levels of advocacy happening in that room, ultimately for the end user, whether people want to accept that or not. That's really what it's about. I wish people could see sometimes the animation and the passion that comes out in some of these meetings, truly advocating for the end user, and I'm not going to get into specifics, but recognizing that a volunteer fire department in a certain part of America may never be able to afford what it is that this standard or this code would require of them. And so that advocacy of making sure that people aren't put into financial peril because they could not afford the training prop or the class or whatever. Like, there is advocacy happening every day in these technical committees. Tons of passion, tons of animation, few tactical timeouts along the way, just to get things back on track. But that's healthy, right? And I think that's the piece that people don't know. They don't know that is going on. They think it's just a bunch of people sitting around checking boxes and saying yes, and no one's actually fighting for the cause.
Yeah, and I've said on a few of those myself, either when I was on committees or since I've been on staff. And it's interesting to see who's fighting for which interest. And sometimes you sit back and go, why is this person really arguing this point when it really is detrimental to their livelihood, let's say? And it's because they understand, using the volunteer fire service as your example, they understand how the volunteer fire service works and the financial and manpower constraints they're under. And they want something that is achievable for them but more importantly, that creates a safer environment for that firefighter who's riding the jump seat, wearing the breathing apparatus, or charging the hose down the line or down the hallway. So it really is interesting. And I kind of got that feeling as well as, yeah, you're there representing the industry, but you're also, they are really concerned about the safety of the end user, the firefighter, the public, from an alarm and fire code standpoint as well. So you're exactly right. You need to sit in those committee meetings to understand what truly happens there.
I think we're in a really good spot right now. So I'm a jump seat firefighter that's super annoyed with NFPA. I've probably gone to Bobby as my battalion chief and said, why can't I use my leather chin strap? Bobby's response is probably going to be something along NFPA standard. How do people get involved? How do people get involved if, let's just say, they may not want to be on a technical committee, but how do they get involved? Is there any sort of public comment? Is there any way for them to get involved?
There's dozens of ways to get involved. I'll kind of get it down to the brass tacks, and this is what I tell everybody right off the rip. If there is a standard, NFPA 1400, for example, that you're interested in, go to the nfpa.org/1400. That's what we call the document info page for NFPA 1400. Everything that you need to know about that document is right there in front of you. It talks about what the current edition is. There's a tab on there that tells you when the next edition is going to be published. And that's kind of the one you need to go to see when this document becomes open for public input. And that's the point in time when you can go into the document, make an edit, and say that all fire trucks should be read, period. All of them. That's what they all should be. And here's why. And make that argument online in a proposed change to the document. It's not live. There's no give and take in that point. It's you're putting in a public input to change something on the document. That's kind of the most basic part of it. And you're done. Literally, you don't have to do another thing. That technical committee has got to take a look at that input. They've got to look at your technical justification to why you think all fire trucks should be read, and then make a decision based on their experience and your input to say, yes, you're right, or no, you're wrong. And then they dispose of that proposal either by putting it into a first draft of the next document or denying the change. That's kind of the first step. And you don't have to go before the committee. You don't have to go before the hearing at the technical session at the NFPA conference next year in front of 2,000 people and argue your case. Now, I will say that if you're going to do that, it helps to have that conversation with that technical committee or maybe some of the members, because invariably, whatever you write in that technical justification, the technical committee, whether it's Bobby or everybody, might have a question about what did you mean by this statement. And the more of those conversations that happen, the more the technical committee understands what your intentions were about what the code is supposed to say. And while that specific phrase might not get into the standard, something pretty close may. So you've had an influence on what the code winds up saying. So the most successful inputs and changes are the ones that are kind of followed up on by the people who are making them, whether it's an organization like the International Association of Fire Chiefs or Billy Huck's Jump Seat Firefighter. The more you engage in that process and having that communications with members of the technical committee, the more likely you're going to be successful. Once the committee does that to that public input and they've said, no, it's a bad idea, we're going to set it aside, you've got another bite at the apple during what's called public comment stage. And then you can come back and say, well, the committee's justification for why they denied this was wrong because here's why. And then they have to take another look at that proposal. And maybe you've made some changes to it. Maybe the committee can make some changes to it. And then it gets into the second draft. So that's how that document gets developed. And there's a few more steps to it that get a little bit more into the technical aspects of it. And, if you've still failed or somebody else has made comments, they can do what's called make a motion before the membership of NFPA. And that's that big meeting at the technical session that happens during our conference every year in June, where you basically make your case to the NFPA membership to be making the change or deleting a change or something like that. That gets a little bit further down the road. Fortunately, within our processes for all of our standards, that motion process is very narrow. All of the standards that got produced this past session, NFPA 70, the electrical code, which is our biggest document, was one of them. That went to the technical session, and all of the motions that were heard across all of the standards that were finalized this year, that whole hearing lasted a day and it was done. So the process that the technical committee uses to vet the change, to make adjustments, to make changes, the public comment that comes through, when it comes out of that piece of the sausage grinder, it's in pretty good shape, I think, and is evidenced by the fact that we don't have days and days and days of technical session meetings of people making motions before the membership to get something changed back or changed the other way. So I think the process works really well for us. It's engaging. You don't have to be an NFPA member to put that public input in. You don't have to be an NFPA member to have a conversation about what the standard says. And it really is pretty easy once you get the technical piece right or figured out on the website. It's web-based changes that you put into the document, and it goes forward from there. So, Billy, I'd be curious what your perspective is being on a technical committee. How did my scenario play out for how it works on your end of the puzzle?
No, it's interesting. I just thought of about 9 more questions that spun off of that, and I think that's part of it, right? You know, you answer one question when it comes to NFPA, and it's like, well, wait a minute, there's more over here. I will tell you from my perspective, and one of the main questions that I had, a standard change. We are, of course, in a standard change with the 1030 standard, and I want to touch on that in just a second. On how NFPA is now consolidating, separate standards into one, why you're going down that road and how you ended up there. But with that being said, from the fire code perspective, we're in a code development cycle right now, and Virginia currently developing the 2024 statewide fire prevention code. Of course, in Virginia, I hear the confusion sometimes. People say, "Oh, we're not an NFPA state in Virginia because our base model code is the International Fire Code." However, there's a reference standards section with that thick, that we talk about nothing but NFPA standards that are enforceable through the fire code. So when we are looking from the current code development cycle, we're looking ahead going, okay, we know that there's going to be a change to NFPA 10 fire extinguishers. How is that going to affect? Oh, and by the way, do we want to be more stringent with things, or do we want to, but how that plays back in for us is definitely challenging at times. I will say that a lot of our folks across the state, whether it be from a locality standpoint with a local fire marshal or the state fire marshal's office, we spend a lot of time with NFPA code reference. And there's times that, I'll pick up the phone and call you, or I know your phone probably rings off the hook. Hey, what was the intent, with this, or how did we end up with this? We're on a, 3-year code cycle in Virginia, and we've got a lapse. Why is the 2018 version of 1123 what we're enforcing in the 2021 version of the statewide fire prevention code for aerial fireworks? So, let's go ahead and jump down that road. How did NFPA end up in this consolidation process? It's something that I've been talking to stakeholders a lot about. There's been a lot of questions, is 1031 fire inspector going to look the same? 1033 investigator, what are the changes that are coming? Why are they going all to this 1030 standard? How did NFPA end up there?
Yeah, I'll stick to, let's say, 1030 as the kind of the consolidated document, because all of them are essentially the same. The content's very different, but all of the 1710, 1730, 1720, all those are getting consolidated, just like the 1030. 31 documents. This goes back about 7 or 8 years now. And NFPA's technical committees, there's a lot of different committees that may be on one standard. The alarm and electrical codes are probably the most complex. So the technical committee for that standard is really about 7 or 8 different committees. So take take the fire inspector, fire investigator, and public educator standards alone, those are just three very closely related documents that the technical committees in most cases were most of the same people. So you wind up serving on three different committees. That means you've got to travel to the committee meeting three different times and maybe have three different Zoom meetings or Teams meetings along the way. And it became a bit of a logistical challenge for NFPA to host in-person meetings three times during the year for basically it's a very, very similar document for the very, very similar people. So the effort was to bring all of those similar content documents together, have one technical committee meeting broken up into a couple of days so that Billy Hux or whoever the technical committee member was really only had to make one trip to the last one I went to was down in Savannah. So you really make one trip to Savannah for a couple of days and you deal with the changes to 1031 and 1035 and all of those related standards in the same road trip, so to speak. Now when it comes out of the sausage grinder, it's now in one document. It's still segregated within that document to what the skill set is. And if I had it up, I could be terribly more accurate on what they are. But chapters 1, 2, and 3 of those consolidated documents are all the same. One is always the administration scope, applicability, and that sort of thing. Chapter 2 is reference standards, and chapter 3 is definitions, and they apply across all the boards. Well, where it starts to change is chapters 4 through however far the document goes. And let's say that dealing with 1030, what was NFPA 1031, those JPRs and all the skills and all the background on 1031 is now chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. 1035 is now chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. And if you look at the table of contents for those new documents, those new consolidated documents, it really says that, chapter 4 is whatever the title is and what it used to be. In parentheses, it used to be NFPA 1031. So all of the protocol standards that are related to fire inspector are still consolidated and still compressed into those specific chapters of NFPA 1030. It's just also now sitting next to the educators and inspectors protocol standards in that same document. It made it a lot easier for NFPA to manage the process of how we conduct technical committee meetings, how the technical committee members are able to be more efficient and effective at being at the technical meetings. And on the other end of the spectrum, what we're hearing is from somebody like logistics, and we're talking about apparatus standards, they don't have to have 4 or 5 books to talk about brush trucks or engines or tankers. It's all in one document now. So they have one reference document that they can look into for whatever that specific piece of apparatus is. So that was kind of the impetus behind it. Those changes were, I will say, a little bit painful going through it because it was a change. And like the fire service, there's 2 things they hate: changing the way things are. The standards change is a little bit of that same kind of painful process going through it. But we've been through all of our documents now that are going through consolidation. I think the last round of those come out this next year. And we've gotten better at it. And I think the community, the end user, the customers understand it better and are implementing it a little bit better on their end too.
Yeah, Bill, I'm going to jump in there real quick. If, when Robbie was talking about that, like chapter 1, 2, and 3, and I think this is super important. We saw a lot of it in 1400 when we consolidated. We're wrapping up. We're in our final, ballot time now. Like this project is almost where it needs to be. But the definitions chapter, I think that was super, super important with that piece. Is that there were some minor inconsistencies, right? Like in one standard, fire behavior may have been defined one way, and then it was a little bit different somewhere else. And so I think the absolute greatest thing that we've done with this consolidation is the consistency that all of those definitions for the entire standard now are consistent and they're the same, and there's no back and forth. I mean, as you know, as testifying in court, subject matter experts, a defense attorney is going to eat alive inconsistencies between you and somebody else using the same term defined, differently. And so these consolidations with the definitions is going to help. There's one fire behavior, one fire dynamics, one whatever definition for all of fire services training now for 1400 instead of there being that word defined in each of those individual standards. And I think that's going to help us a lot, consistency wise, education, training, testifying, in your world. All of those things are going to be really helpful with that. So I just wanted to jump in on that specific chapter 3 piece, because I think that's super important for people to recognize, is that this consolidation is also cleaning up some of what people have complained about, and that's discrepancies or inconsistencies among standards. So I think it's a huge, huge win there.
Yeah, exactly right. That was one of the other advantages to it. We were starting to see that creep in more because we had different committees dealing with same topical areas saying, well, it really means this, it really means that, or worse yet, in the technical aspects of the document deeper in, we're seeing that being resolved as well. So great point.
Now, numerous conversations again, just this year with stakeholders, and their first question is why? Why is it changing? And you hit on it there towards the end, Robbie. It's the best way I described it is efficiency. Of course, when I really look at the years of NFPA and the conversations and the arguments, if you will, the ability has always been there for participation, and the fact that is it an educational piece that we just need to educate people and they need to be there? Do they just want to sit around and complain about something because it's the easiest thing? I don't know. What our goal is here is to get everybody on the same sheet of music, to, again, through education, showing, hey, listen, you have buy-in, you have the ability to affect change. So that being said, we've been recording for about a half an hour now. I will throw you probably the last question, at least that I have, and I'll give Bobby a chance to throw a last question at you. Standards. Are all the standards updated at the same frequency? How do we end up with a new standard?
All of our standards are updated either on a 3 or a 5 year cycle, depending upon what the standard is. Our turnout gear standards and a lot of the PPE standards are on 5 years. Our building codes and fire codes standards are updated every 3 years. And again, if you go to that document info page, nfpa.org/whatever the number is, you can find out when that document's due to be revalidated or updated or whatever phrase you'd like to use. But count on every 3 years. Technology is changing so fast that even the 3 year pace is not quick enough in some cases. And we've been accused of being too slow. Even at a 3 year pace. Don Michelle Bellis, who's our standards administrator, brought it up one day at I think it was a fire marshals forum last fall, and said, we're not slow, we are deliberate, and we're deliberate on purpose to have the proper conversations with the technical committee so the technical committees can do their work over time, so that the public has the opportunity to have inputs and comments to the technical committee, so that we get the document correct the first time. We're seeing this time and time again today with legislation, some special interest going to the legislators and pitching this idea on a Friday, and on Wednesday it becomes law. And, all the fire code officials and fire safety professionals are going, what? You did what? To what? How many stories? How many exits? And that's the challenge that lawmakers have, is they have a 2 or 3 month cycle to get bills through. And we wind up with bad sausage at the end of the sausage grinder. We've got a 3 year at least process where the technical committee does their homework, does the research, really evaluates the true impact to the end user, whether they be the firefighter on the apparatus or the public living in that apartment building, to see what the best document we should have out there is. So the short answer to your question is every document's reviewed every 3 years or 5 years, depending upon what it is. And they're on cycles. Most of the similar documents are on the same year update, but they vary from document to document.
Awesome. Bobby, what's your last question while we got this, man?
Yeah, I'm gonna bring it back down to kind of the population that I serve, both on the committee and in the field, and that's that end user. And I want your kind of perspective on it, because I could describe it, but I would probably do it no justice. But let's talk about appendix language and like appendixes within the standards, because there's a lot of discussion that appendixes may not be actually part of the standard, that it's just information that's there for the user. It's not actually part of the standard. there's some confusion there at the training officer world, at the apparatus world, the OC health world. I don't care what standards you're living in. There's some concern or some discrepancy in the belief of what is appendix language, or how does the appendix apply to the standard. And I'd love to hear that perspective from you, because I know I would butcher it compared to your answer.
Well, don't keep that bar too high, so I might butcher it as well too. But I'll try. I'll give it a good shot here. You're right. The appendix is not part of the standard. The standard says you shall have this. You shall meet this listing requirement. You must do X or Y. The standard tells you in requirement language, mandatory language of what you have to do to comply with the standard. Then if you look at the appendix, that it is truly what the technical committee felt will help the end user who's reading that document better understand that part of the document, or maybe give them some options. The appendix language typically uses phrases like can, may, should. It's not mandatory language that you do it, but it gives the end user, the person who's reading the book, some kind of guidance on maybe where that language came from, what the true intent of that language is, so that if you're an AHJ and you're the one who's enforcing this standard, it can give you maybe a little bit of interpretation guidance on how you, the code official, the AHJ who's enforcing the standard, is really going to say, yes, this complies with the standard, or no, this does not. That's the biggest part of what Appendix A is in all of our documents. Other appendices that are out there, B, C, and it may have letters up to F and G. But there's other stuff that may be their checklists. Example, community risk reduction plans was one that was in one of the standards I was dealing with. Other types of material, maybe even some research that the NFPA Research Foundation has included that may be helpful in how you implement or how you enforce that particular code. So you're exactly right. The code, the standard is the standard. Chapters 1 through whatever the number is the standard. When you get into the letters, Appendix A, B, C, that is there for informational purposes that can help the end user, whether they be the person who's trying to comply or the person who's verifying compliance, can use to give them some better guidance into what that specific section of the document actually means.
No, I appreciate it. And that was what I was hoping that we would get out of that, is because I want people to know that is information for them to use. So I always think back now to like the fuel packages piece, for live fire training. You shall do this in the live fire piece, but the appendices is showing tested, validated, tried fuel packages that will satisfy the shall part earlier in the standard. And so that's what I think that I was trying to get across, is to make sure that people knew and understand how to use those appendices. So I appreciate that, Robbie. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly right.
Shall, may, could, should, would. Yeah. It gets confusing sometimes. All right, gents. Well, again, we don't want to bore everyone to death. I think we really did hit the intent of what we were looking to do today. Robbie, thank you. Thank you for coming with us today. I have no idea where you're at, because I never know where you're at. I usually start a text off with where in the world is Waldo today. Yeah. So that being said, want to kick it back to you. What's one thing you want to leave everyone with? And I also expect maybe a little plug for your own podcast. You did start podcasting before podcasting was cool. So
well, I don't know about that part, but yeah, I'll share a couple things from an NFPA's perspective. One is we talked about a lot of stuff about how the standards get developed, and we really hit a high level of that. I'll give you my email address, and that's part of my job as a regional director, is to kind of help the stakeholder, the end user, the AHJ navigate their way through the codes and standards process. And if you want help putting the public input in, or public comment, or becoming a member of a technical committee, I can certainly help folks through that process, and maybe even give them a couple of helpful tips along the way as to what may help you gain success in that based on my own experience. And feel free to reach out to me through that. It's rdawson@nfpa.org. So just first initial, last name @nfpa.org. One last comment for NFPA's perspective is, Bobby, I think you talked about it as what the people thought these standards came from. And NFPA just launched a pretty substantial public awareness campaign, not directed at the fire service. This is directed at the communities that the fire service serves. And we're seeing this assault on safety, people going to legislatures, undermining the codes and standards development process, and really changing the standards in the ways that they shouldn't be changed. And we've got two efforts out there. Really, it's the same effort. It's one website is don'tchancesafety.org. It's a pretty moving graphical commercial that talks about where these standards come from and how they get developed, and that the public needs to be aware that when you go into a hospital, that NFPA 199 and all of the standards that surround how that building is built is there protecting them in the background all the time. The other one is Jonathan Scott, who's a home renovation specialist. I think he's got an HGTV program as well. A pretty comical commercial about reverse renovations. And I'd say go check out both of those commercials on both of those websites, reverserenovations.org and don'tchancesafety.org, and see what NFPA is doing on the built side of the environment to make our world safer. And it is a big world. We're trying to protect it together. And we want people, the public that aren't associated with the building industry, that aren't associated with the fire service, to understand it's just not something that happens by chance. Safety is an intentional act, and it's intentional on purpose. And we do that through the codes and standards that people like Billy Hucks and all of our fire and building officials out there are enforcing daily. So, you mentioned the personal podcast. That's kind of a personal passion of mine, and telling some legacy stories. It's the Firehouse Logbook Podcast. You can search for that. Reach out to me if you got any questions. But I've had an absolute blast doing that podcast. I've had conversations with retirees, some new folks, literally weeks on the job, and it's really fun to see their different perspectives on life and the fire service and what they're there for. So check that out too if you get a chance.
All right. Well, it looks like we may have lost Billy again, so I'll keep us going for just a couple minutes. Give us something to work with here at the end. But no, man, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you giving us that insight, and I think that it's just important to understand this process. So I do appreciate your time. Appreciate what you're doing for us, and that it's not just us, the fire service. We're such a small portion of what NFPA does, and I think that that's where our industry sometimes is losing scope and sight, is that we think that NFPA is just about the fire department or the fire service, and it's so much broader than that. We're just one apple in the bushel that NFPA is carrying around. So I appreciate what you're doing. So Billy, that's all I got.
One apple that's near and dear to my heart because of 30 plus years in the fire service. So,
absolutely.
So I'm certainly looking forward to it. So I'll say, hey, thanks guys for having me on this. Best of luck to you with this podcast. I'll certainly share it around and chat it up every chance I get. So,
yep, sounds good.
We definitely appreciate that, Robbie. And we do know that it'll be published. We had episode 1 with the boss, and she gave us the head nod. So we may only have 2 episodes, but we'll see how this thing turns out in the future. So thanks again for the time today, and we look forward to the future. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, man.
Thanks, Billy. Thanks, Bobby.
Prepare, respond, survive. When seconds count, train with the best. Fire facilities, custom steel towers built for real-world fire training. Be ready, be resilient.